So I would like to introduce our next speakers, Dr. Lauren Aaronson and Rick Barohn. Lauren is the Deputy Director of Frontiers, the Heartland Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, and I think you guys are in your third year, good and making progress, and I'm sure you'll be sharing a lot of that with us. At the University of Kansas Medical Center, and then a number of partners in the area, including the center, who's been participating in that. She is also a professor in the Department of Public Health, Policy and Management at the School of Nursing, who is really our primary host today. Dr. Aaronson is also the principal investigator for the Heartland Institute of Clinical and Translational Research and the author of many distinguished peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Barohn is Rick Barohn is the principal investigator of the National Institutes of Health, Clinical and Translational Science Award, and the NeuroNext grant at the KU Medical Center, and serves as the director of Frontiers. So he and Lauren work closely together. He is also, and newly, it's not ordained, what are you guys over here? Appointed, distinguished professor and chairman at the University of Kansas Medical Center, which is a quite of an honor, and we're very proud of Dr. Barohn for that. He's the author of more than 200 journal publications, does a lot of work in the neuro area, neuromuscular diseases, and has been listed as one of the best doctors in America. So please welcome to the podium Drs. Aaronson and Barohn.
Okay. What we're going to do is I'm going to talk first, and then Rick will come up here and talk, and then I'll wrap things up again. So give you a little overview of what we're going to be presenting today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the historical context for the emergence of translational research. Not so much what it is, the emergence of what it is, it's been around, but the term translational research, which has been one that has challenged many of us over the last decade or so. Some of the key concepts involved in translational research and learning health systems relevant for those. Then Rick will come up and give us some, talk about some real life experiences that he's had with using ethical consultations in some of the translational research that he's been doing. And then I will wrap things up a little bit with some new directions and new technologies that will harken back to some of the things we've heard this morning as well. So with that, to begin with a little of the history, and I'll be a little quick, just over a decade ago, when Elias Zerhouni was the director of the National Institutes of Health, he pulled together stakeholders from the scientific community, the healthcare provider community, and the public to identify and prioritize what are some of the most pressing problems facing health and medical research. And the underlying concern at that time was what could not be done by a single institute, but rather needed the whole of NIH to focus on. And the concern over why and how it was taking way too long to move some of the new discoveries that were happening in laboratories into actual practice in health care, which clearly is a concern for a learning health system as well. So out of these consultations came what came to be known as the NIH Roadmap for Research. And that was initiated with three broad themes: new pathways to discovery, research teams of the future, and re-engineering the clinical research enterprise. This really represented a very new emphasis for NIH at the time. I also happen to have had the privilege of being invited to go to NIH in 2004 and 2005 and participate in some of the activities of enacting the Roadmap for Research and its initiatives. And while NIH still has its silos of separate institutes and centers, and they are a very big part of NIH. There was, in fact, an important shift towards an emphasis now on clinical and translational research, on interdisciplinary science, and on multidisciplinary teams. And that this was some of the ways that were being identified to be able to help move more rapidly new discoveries to practice and to overcome what were being identified as the roadblocks to see that happen. So, of course, one of the first questions that was asked is, where are these roadblocks for moving the discoveries into practice? And at that time, when it was being talked about, NIH was identifying really two critical points at which those roadblocks occurred. And the first was taking that new discovery from the laboratory or in preclinical work from at the bench and moving it into trials in humans. And then the other major point of roadblock was identified of once we have all this evidence, I think we heard a little about that too this morning, we have all this evidence, but what's happening that we're not getting it into practice when we know this works and yet it's not happening? But if we were to overcome the roadblocks, it wasn't enough just to identify where they were. We also needed to identify some of what they were. And among those identified were the increasing costs and complexity of doing clinical and translational research, the increase in regulatory burdens, which is it was really an interesting one and a good one that the NIH wanted to focus on, because everything we talk about in the ethical realm and the questions, these are really important issues, and we don't deny the relevance of them. But in fact, what was being discovered was that there were many who were choosing not to go into clinical and translational research simply because it took too long. And for an academician in particular, when they have a tenure clock ticking along, it was a lot easier to go into the lab where they had a whole lot more control and did not have to confront some of those sticky ethical issues that happen when we start doing research with humans. Another issue was the shortage of information systems, and we've heard some about big data, and we'll be talking a little bit about what we've been doing as well in that area. And then to problems with recruiting people and retaining people to participate in our research studies. And then lastly, another arm of the difficulty recruiting and retaining was actually educating and training a new cadre of clinical and translational researchers. So each of those have had plenty of implications for both getting clinical and translational research done, and for, in the practice arena, the learning health systems. So to respond to that, these concerns, the NIH Clinical and Translational Science Award Program was launched in 2005 as the signature program under that re-engineering the clinical research enterprise theme of the roadmap. And this was clearly intended to radically alter how we were doing clinical and translational research across the country. It replaced the formal General Clinical Research Center program, GCRCs, which some of you may be familiar with, that had been funded by NIH for over 40 years at over 80 medical centers, academic health centers across the country. But instead, that if you wanted to keep that funding, you needed to compete for one of these CTSA grants. These were set up very differently. They were set up to be a national consortium. How can we work together on the problems to increase clinical and translational research? The GCRC program, they were each all mostly separate units. There was very little, if any, collaboration that happened across those sites. Not so much the case now, or at least what is being pushed with the CTSA program to function as a consortium. And as on this slide says, to tackle these complex challenges, to encourage collaborative teams of diverse investigators, again recognizing that it is not any single discipline that is really going to be able to bring us the answers we need to the complex clinical problems we're facing today, and to address those roadblocks of moving discoveries into practical solutions for patients. So, seen as a solution, the CTSA program mandated a number of critical core units that needed to be part of a program, and I'm only highlighting some of those here. One would be a major educational program, again, addressing the shortage of investigators. The requirement of a multidisciplinary involvement. I remember in the very early days they said if an application came in submitted by a school of medicine, it will not be reviewed and it will be rejected. It must come at a higher level in the university. It must include more disciplines. So when we're talking about multidiscipline, we're not talking about neurology talking to gynecology or obstetrics. We're really talking much broader than that, bringing in engineers, bringing in nursing, physical therapy, a number of different disciplines. And then having an infrastructure that will support those necessary regulatory requirements and try to help investigators move through the processes that we have in place for oversight of research so that it is conducted in a most ethical way. Also, a very strong emphasis on biomedical informatics. It was, in fact, for our program, the last hurdle we needed to get over to get our funding was to really shore up our biomedical informatics activities. And two, recognizing the role of the patient and the community in this effort, that we're not doing this to people, but hopefully with people. And so community engagement became a required part. How are we including people? And ethics was called out as a separate unit, as a necessary part of all of these programs that we're hoping to get funded. Early on, then, the question became, how do we define translational research? I know certainly when we got funded, and I told anybody I talked to that, with the name, first question was, what is translational research? And those first early definitions initially focused on those two roadblocks. So that what came out was there was T1 translational research, which was looking at applying the discoveries generated during research in the laboratory and in preclinical studies to the development of trials and studies in humans. And T2 was just embodied the research aimed at enhancing the adoption of best practices in the community. But as the various CTSA programs came about and were launched across the country and became more operational, the definition and spectrum of translational research became more refined, more specified, so that now we look at it in a little more discrete pieces. And we say the T1 research is when we're first translating to humans, the phase 1 trials in the more traditional clinical research, where the focus is on discovery and safety. And then moving to T2, where we're doing those initial translation to patients in our phase 2 and phase 3 trials, where the focus is on safety and efficacy. Does this work? What are our clinical trials showing? T3 is then capturing that translation to practice, where we have our phase 4 trials, where the focus is on effectiveness, and where we also see some of the health services research that is important in this area that's looking at implementation, dissemination, and communication. And so here, a lot of the focus is on getting the word out into practice, so that, for example, every time a diabetic patient is seen by a healthcare provider, that somebody looks at their feet and the number of amputations we could prevent if in fact that really happened, and why doesn't it? And then lastly here was the translation to populations, where we're looking at policy studies, population outcome studies, and the focus is really on our ultimate goal, which is improving the health of our populations. Now, we'd be remiss if we didn't also acknowledge that it is not just a linear, unidirectional path from discovery to implementation and practice and improving the population of the health, but rather anywhere along this trajectory, things happen, ideas, questions emerge that can lead to feedback, generating research at some earlier stage in this translational arm. So I'm just going to quickly now show you again, for those who are not familiar with the national program, here's a not quite current map, since they just announced the 62nd CTSA in New Hampshire, Dartmouth, so that's not on this map. But this shows you the map of where all of the national centers are that are currently funded by NIH. And we're very proud of our position right there in the center of the country with the Frontiers program. And we highlight both Kansas and Missouri because when we put this program together, we really wanted it to be a regional effort. And so we worked collaboratively with our partners on both sides of the state line. And this just shows you some of our main partners in the Frontiers program itself. On this slide, we have, it's a very complex, and we don't have time to go into all the components of the program, but I'm highlighting here some, and you can see what they all are, but the Education Center, the Community Partnership for Health, the Ethics Program, and our Biomedical Informatics program, which I think all have a lot of relevance for learning health systems. So if you're interested in learning more about Frontiers in particular, there's a picture of our website and our web address, and do feel free to browse it. We welcome any comments and criticisms or suggestions for improving it. It is a constantly evolving website, and I don't think there's been a week that we haven't worked on doing something to improve it and make it better. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague and partner, Dr. Richard Barohn, and he will talk about some of his
Thanks, Lauren. What Lauren didn't tell you was, where's the map?
Oh.
So the day, I remember very well the day we got the Notice of Grant Award. We were in Barbara Atkinson's office, and we had our usual monthly meeting. And at the beginning of the meeting, we checked the website, and there was no score posted. And 30 minutes later, we said, well, let's just check one more time. So Barbara went behind her desk, checked. We got a score of 14. And all I remember, there was a lot of hugging and screaming and laughing, and very exciting day. And it's really, I think, transformed how we do things here in Kansas City and the region. So when John and Linda first asked Lauren and I to speak at this meeting, I knew we could sort of tell the Frontier story, but I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about with regard to research and ethics. And so I decided I would just take the practical thing and talk about my two experiences using ethics and community engagement components of Frontiers on two real projects that are going on now. So I think I'll just summarize that story, and then I'll let Lauren talk about some future projects that sort of take this even a step further. So I'm going to talk about two times that I consulted the ethics component of Frontiers. One was an ALS study, a phase 2 study on that translational research. This would be a T2 research, and the other is a comparative effectiveness study that I'm trying to get off the ground. And that would be an example of T3 research. So first let's talk about the ALS study. So this involves a team across the country, Western ALS Study Group, Muscle Study Group, investigators here and on both coasts. And it's a phase 2 study looking at Rasagiline in ALS. So why Rasagiline? Rasagiline is a drug that's approved for Parkinson's disease. It's an MAO inhibitor. It increases dopamine. But in addition to that, it also had been known from the preclinical T1 work, preclinical and T1 work, to have this neuroprotective activity in neuron cell cultures. And it seems working at the mitochondrial level, not at the dopaminergic level. And so one of my young faculty, Ansha Wang, she was junior faculty at the time. It's not coming through? Oh, down. It's too loud. She had found this article out of the Teva labs where they had used Rasagiline in a mouse model of ALS, and the mice lived longer. And she said, we need to try this drug in ALS. So she went and got an investigator-initiated grant from Teva for like $250,000 to study Rasagiline in about 30 ALS patients in an open-label fashion. A doc we knew in Israel had already had a little bit of Rasagiline experience in an ALS clinic. She thought it might have worked. And the Europeans we knew were starting a Rasagiline study. And we do know that in ALS, there is some dysfunction of the mitochondria. We don't know if it's a chicken or the egg phenomena, but the mitochondria aren't working well. So we started this phase 2 open label study of Rasagiline, and we had 9 sites involved through the Western ALS Study Group. We were the primary site. Dr. Wang was the PI to see if the drug was safe in this population and to see if maybe we could slow the disease down a bit. And then we also had this idea to work with Dr. Swerdlow in his lab here at KU, this Alzheimer's lab, to see if we can measure mitochondrial function as a biomarker. So this is sort of what happened with that study. The drug was safe. We had some side effects, but they were tolerable, and so we established that. We looked at ALS progression using this scale that we have called the ALS Functional Rating Scale. And this is our group here, and we compared the decline in the ALS-FRS against other studies that we had been involved in, and this is a minocycline study, a Celebrex study, a creatine study. You know, the problem with ALS is almost every study I've been involved in the last 30 years has been negative, except for one glutamate inhibitor called Riluzole, which had a very modest effect. So all these studies that were negative studies, we know what the slope of the decline is, and basically we found in this study, in 36 patients open label, that the slope of the decline was almost identical as in these other studies. So, but then at the same time we were doing these biomarkers in Swerdlow's lab. And we were able to find, at least in the blood, which may not be happening in the brain, but in the blood, using a variety of biomarkers, here's just 2 of them, we were able to show that we were significantly changing the mitochondrial membrane potentials from baseline to 6 months to 12 months. So we were hyperpolarizing the mitochondrial membrane. This is very exciting stuff. Everyone's looking for biomarkers in these neurodegenerative diseases, and we had a few other blood measurements as well. So that looked good. So the ethical question, at the same time we were doing the open label study, I put in an R1, which we got, to do a placebo-controlled study in 80 patients, 20 on placebo, 60 on Rasagiline, over 12 months. It would be the next step, another phase 2 trial. But the question is, can you ethically go on to the next step when we already know that at least on this small window on Rasagiline, we didn't hit a home run? We didn't dramatically change the course of ALS in these 36 patients. So you would think, well, sure, why not? But actually, some of our sites really had an issue with it, and they did not think they could ethically randomize patients in this next study based on the open label pilot study. So we went in our Frontiers portal and put in a consult to our ethics core We met with John Lantos, and he got some other input, and we laid it out to him. The investigators on the grant laid it out to him, and the opinion from the ethics group was that we could go on to the next study as long as we had full disclosure to the subjects about the results that we had in our open label study. We put that in the consent form in some fashion. And so we did that. We modified the consent form based on the ethics consultation. Now I just enrolled 3 patients into this study. Actually, that's what I was doing at 11 o'clock. That's why I wasn't here. I enrolled the 3rd patient in this study in the research building. And so we're off and rolling. Still, one of the 9 sites, Minnesota, they really agonized over this, and the 3 neurologists up there decided, no, we just don't think we can do this. And so they dropped out, and we replaced them with another site. So that was really the first time I had ever used an ethics core to help me and my investigators with the decision on how to go on with the clinical trial. And this is a pretty standard phase 2 clinical trial, either open label or placebo controlled. And this is the type of work I've been doing for years, these sorts of trials. And again, when we first started this whole idea of translational research, and we had those 2 definitions, T1 and T2, I sort of felt left out. I sort of felt like I was orphaned because I didn't do either of those things. So now we have this new definition, so now I'm proud to be a T2 researcher. I sort of fit in that group. So the next one, briefly, is a study that I'm trying to get off the ground. And this is something very new for me and my group, to do comparative effectiveness research. So it's really T3 research. And we call this study Pain Controls. It's sort of a catchy name. The center and Linda Ward have been helping us quite a bit with thinking about this trial and designing it. And the trial is about the following. So peripheral neuropathy is actually very common, whereas ALS is a rare disease. Neuropathy is common. Most neuropathies, we think, in the United States are due to diabetes. But there's a really large group of people who get neuropathy with pain in their feet that do not have diabetes. We think it's at least 25%, and it may be 50% of the neuropathies out there in the population. And we call that C-SPAN, cryptogenic sensory polyneuropathy. And that's the term we use in our clinic, C-SPAN. So there are drugs that have come out for diabetic neuropathy for painful feet. Pregabalin, duloxetine, older drugs, tricyclics, but no one has ever done comparative effectiveness studies to see which drug works the best and which has the fewest side effects in a population of patients, nor will industry ever do that study. And so we thought the only people that are ever going to do this are the investigators. And so we designed a study to PCORI to determine which drug is most effective and has the fewest side effects. So because of the cost restrictions of the PCORI amount of money we were going to get if we get funded, I wanted to do 6 drugs. I wanted to have a narcotic in there. It just got too complicated and expensive. So we had to step back, and we decided to use 4 drugs, nortriptyline, duloxetine, pregabalin, and mexiletine in this comparative effectiveness study, and as to determine which drug had most effective and had the fewest side effects. So this was the problem that we had. If we were going to do 4 drugs, we needed 400 patients. If we were going to do 6 drugs, we needed 600 patients, basically. And we're using this Bayesian adaptive design that our statisticians here helped us do all this. But if we did it the old-fashioned way, like I'd done in my prior studies, where patients agree to be in the trial, they sign consent, they get randomized to one of the drugs, you have an arrangement with a research pharmacy, they put all the drugs, they over-encapsulate them all so the patients don't know what they're on, and we don't know what they're on, and then you have to take exactly the same amount of pills. Each group would have to take the same amount of pills each day. That trial would have cost us $5 million. And we knew all we could get from PCORI was $1.5 million. So the PCORI people actually helped us on this, because first we put in a budget for $5 million, and they said, no, we don't fund $5 million grants. but they said, well, why don't you just don't do it unblinded? And so people know what they're on. And they said, that's really what you do in the real world. That's what PCORI is all about. It's real world medicine. And so we stepped back, and I thought, okay, let's think about that. And we figured out we could do it for $1.5 million if we use that model. So the model is that patients get randomized to one of the 4 drugs. You get the randomization back from the statistician. Then the doctor writes the script in the EMR, usually these days, for one of the 4 drugs. The patient knows what they're getting. The doc knows what they're getting. So we're randomized, but we're not blinded, and there's no placebo. And we see who the winner and the losers are. So we could do that study. And actually, that's more like what we do in the real world. But the problem is the ethical question, and I had never done this. So the ethical question was, can you randomize subjects to a drug that they will then have to pay for through their insurance? Number one. And number 2 is, can you randomize subjects to a drug in which their insurance may decide not to pay for it? Because we get these denials all the time because they want you to try a different drug, the insurance companies. So I didn't know the answer to that. And most of my partners, the neurology partners, and I'll be listening to what Richard thinks about this later, but they felt very uncomfortable with this because they were used to the old traditional model. And so I said, well, it's time to meet with an ethicist. So we put in our ethics consult, and we talked about this, and we had all of our investigators and our steering committee involved. And so the answer that we got was, we could do this. This is really what cancer does, in a way. Cancer's been way ahead of the game on this for probably different reasons. Number one, we could do it. Number 2, they suggested that we build in the grant, we could afford this, a stipend. It wouldn't say you use the stipend to pay for your drug, but we give them a stipend for participating. If they wanted to use that money to pay for their drug or whatever their copay was, then they could. And so that's what we ended up doing. And then this other issue is, what if the insurance company denies them? Then we decided to use that almost as an outcome measure, so to sort of make lemonade out of lemons, and to see how many met criteria, but then would be dropouts because they couldn't be enrolled as sort of another secondary endpoint. And so this actually came out of our ethics consultation. We hadn't thought of either of those, so we incorporated it. We put it in the grant. Before we submitted the grant, we did one other thing, which I would have, again, never done before Frontiers. But we got our community engagement section involved, and Kim Kimminau leads this with Alan Greiner. And so we gave her names of about 20 neuropathy patients who agreed to be contacted by her. She brought them all together in a room. She talked to them. Then we came in. We talked about the study. We talked about all these issues. We wanted to make sure that we were good, that we had buy-in from the community and potential patient populations, and it was really a learning experience for me, and it was tremendous. So is this your talk now? Yeah, now we're back to you. So that's my 2 real-world examples of how we have used sort of ethics and the community engagement sections of Frontiers to help us with design of our trials. So I'm going to turn this back over to Lauren, and then we'll take questions on those 2 examples in the panel.
Okay. All right, so just to sort of wrap up and talk a little bit more about where we are in Frontiers, clearly biomedical and clinical research informatics has brought us over the last short term, actually, I think it's been incredibly rapid, some very powerful tools for both translational research and learning health systems. And these are the electronic health records, the large data repositories, and biospecimen repositories, among things. And we're happy to share that we think that our program and our efforts in Frontiers has helped us be a bit on the cutting edge of this. Certainly our participation in the National CTSA Consortium has facilitated that. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about REDCap or CRIS. Those are software programs to enter and manage data. REDCap being something some of you may be familiar with. It's a national open source software. It stands for Research Electronic Data Capture. CRIS is a local system that we use here at KU, Clinical Research Information System, that is based on a commercial software platform, Velos. But what I am going to talk about to just wrap up this slide is both HERON, our Frontiers Patient Registry, the Pioneers Participant Registry that we just launched a couple weeks ago, I believe, and the recent PCORI grant that we have submitted at the end of September. So what HERON is what we've heard about a little bit more, is a de-identified database that uses the electronic health records from the KU clinics and hospitals and created them in a way to make them accessible to researchers in a de-identified way. It stands for Healthcare Enterprise Repository for Ontological Narration. We never say that. Everybody knows it as HERON. It was a little tip of the hat to our former EVC, Barbara Atkinson, and her love of birds. And so that is, and this is the website that can be used. And on this slide I have, and in the interest of time, I'm going to try to go really fast here, but you see the various sources where we get the data from the EPIC medical record, from our billing, IDX. We also have the Social Security death master file incorporated in it. And this is a living database in that it is constantly being upgraded and things are being added. One of the things that I'm particularly proud of is that we have nursing observations and nursing data available to look at, and I think we're only one of 2 CTSAs that actually also includes the data from the nurses that are caring for patients in these databases. The Frontiers Patient Registry was a brilliant idea on the part of Dr. Barohn, I think initially, to help those of us who are not clinicians and don't have a natural patient group to invite to participate in our studies. And we came up with a HIPAA-compliant, but not needing IRB or human subjects approval, form that patients who came to KU clinics could sign after giving information, in which they simply give us permission to release their name and contact information only, nothing else about them, to an investigator who has approval, has an IRB-approved study, to be contacted to see if they'd be interested in participating in that research study. This is, then we can search HERON. There are ways to re-identify the data so that we can get that. But the patients that do sign this form saying, yes, you may call me if there's a study I might be eligible for, and we can release that to investigators. It serves a fabulous purpose as well for investigators who are putting grants together, who can quickly go in and identify not only, you need to say, do you have access to the people who might be eligible to your study? And the reviewers are concerned about that. They can go in and not only say that at this institution we have, 450 with this diagnosis, but not only that, 250 of them have indicated they're willing to participate in research. Now, they may not want to be in that study, but at least they've made the first step. And so that, and then the one that we're really very proud of recently that just got launched, and there's literature at the back of the room about, is our Pioneers Participant Registry. As we talked about, we set up Frontiers to be a regional effort, and we have our partners, but there are always the issues of the medical records, et cetera, and the Frontiers Registry is currently only available to KU investigators. So we wanted to set up an even larger registry that would include people beyond KU patients as well, but that would be open to all the investigators at all of our sites, and anyone in the community could sign up for. And that is the Pioneers Participant Registry. And when people go on that site, this is a registry in which they can search. Anyone in the community could search where there are active studies. We will post a very lay-friendly little description. We're putting them in an FAQ format. What's the study about? Just a sentence or two. Who is eligible? And then who do you contact? You know, we'll give the name of the principal investigator, but sometimes it's a study coordinator who's the main contact person. But also in the security measures, this project did have to go to human subjects because through this, we didn't automatically have access to medical records to find out if somebody's eligible. You know, we don't want to contact women if we're doing a study on prostate cancer or something. I mean, it's, you know, you want to at least somehow target it. So we were needing to ask for a brief health history that is self-report. This became a requirement for human subjects, and doing it on the web required a lot of security. So we had a lot of ethical challenges and legal challenges in actually getting this to be able to fully launch, where one goes on, says they're interested, but you have to sign on with an email, and then you get to the email address that you gave us the link that actually takes you to the questionnaire about, we use REDCap for this, that asks for that health history. And we included an optional ask that if they are a KU patient, because that's the only one we now have access to the health records, may we access your health records? And I think we're currently working with Children's to be able to similarly add if you're, because you can sign up your child, or you can sign up also another family member or someone for whom you may have legal guardianship, etc. So we see that as a tool. We developed this with our community. We got a whole lot of community feedback on both the development of this site and its user friendliness, and we are really happy about where it's going so far. So let's see what's next. So next steps for a learning health system, just have a little here from a 2011 IOM report, and how information technology is really serving as the functional engine for a continuous learning system. And that effective biomedical research organizations must integrate medical informatics and clinical research informatics capabilities with the operational clinical systems of health systems. And what we're really hoping through all of these efforts in the CTSAs, that we're bringing better together the academic medical centers, the research end of things, with the actual healthcare practice to serve both the needs for new discoveries, research, and the need for the continuous quality improvement in healthcare practice and delivery. And the very last is that the PCORI grant we submitted is really looking to do this for at least some parts of our country. We don't have the Scandinavian benefits of national data on people, but they put out a call for two types of networks, one for research networks, one for patient-powered networks. I know the Center for Practical Bioethics was very involved in working on one patient-powered one, and Dr. Russ Waitman, who heads up our Frontiers Biomedical Informatics section, took the lead as the principal investigator to put in a clinical data research network in which the requirement for these, they just went in the end of September. We hope to hear in December or so whether we got funded. It required active involvement of the healthcare systems, clinicians, researchers, and patients in every stage of what one does with these networks, from governance through all phases of study design and implementation, and a commitment to establish interoperability and data sharing across networks to collaborate with larger research community. It required 2 health systems at a minimum, had to go in. You couldn't go in as a single system. And it required covering at least 1 million lives that you could reach through those 2 systems. And the capacity to conduct both observational studies and randomized trials, especially comparative effectiveness trials, that would be embedded in clinical settings and include safety, surveillance, etiology, and of course, rigorous data security, confidentiality, and IRB oversight that has to go along with those projects. So here just gives you a picture of the program we put in, marshaling a collaboration among 10 institutions across 7 states. So we called it the Greater Plains Collaborative. And these are the institutions involved. And so I will just end by saying when we talk about translational research, we can look at it from 2 perspectives. As a process, it's a bridge that is linking bench research with clinical research and clinical research with healthcare practice in the community. And as an outcome, it can be conceived of as our destination, improving the health of the public. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. I just wanted to, in the interest of time, I'm probably going to dispense with my remarks. I just want to kind of piggyback on what they've said, though. If the patient-powered research network gets funded and the CDRN gets funded, we will be going back to the Frontiers group with basically our main objective for the coming year, which will also be to implement an outcomes research ethical framework, which actually Sarah's going to be talking about, that we're adopting based on a publication that Hastings did in January of this year, that Richard brought to us. He's a member of the board of Hastings, brought to the center, and said this is something we need to take a look at. So it really will be an ethical framework that will allow us to be able to proceed. We've developed 5 major objectives associated with it, and hopefully we'll be able to announce that to you very shortly. Soon after the announcements in December, if we both get funded for our PCORI projects. But in the meantime,